Welcome, everyone, to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast.
Quintin Shepherd.
So much fun with him. And he was so early in the podcast, in my doing the podcast. And that's why I wanted to bring him back, because I feel like he's got good messages and good energy. And he talked about, he talked about feed forward. Tell me what your thoughts are about feed forward.
I wrote the thing that matters to me. I think, obviously, you were like, I was like, this is kind of cool. And you're like, feed forward. And I was like, oh, you're such a pessimist. I thought I was the pessimist.
I will tell you, look, I've come up with active negative data. So, at least he's got feed forward as opposed to feedback, and saying feedback judgmental, and feed forward actually thinks about how do you get better, and it's about collaboration. And so, look, I'm okay with it. It's true. I was like, oh, you're making up words. Well, I came up with the term active negative data. And that is where you perseverate over what's not working as opposed to what is working. And here's a guy who is on the other end, who's going, how do we focus on what is working? Appreciative inquiry. So I take it back.
I love the reframe that he said, is that and you and I have talked about this, the difference between the complex and complicated problems, where he's like, I just need engagement or really feedback on solving a complicated problem. You guys gave the jet engine example in it. And I'm like, yeah, that's such a good example of like, well, let's all decide and think about and reflect and brainstorm. What are the possible ways we could address this jet engine problem? Like this, that's just complicated.
I did think about him though, when the airline I fly most regularly, Alaska Air, had a door fly open. I went, well, maybe they could spend a little bit more time making sure everything's in order.
That's so funny. I liked when he said ownership, when feed forward is about ownership of a complex challenge.
Yes. Okay. So if it's okay, I'd like to talk more about this after everyone hears my conversation with Quintin Shepherd. But before we get into that conversation, I do have a question. What is a way that you celebrated Halloween in your classroom?
What did I do in my classroom? Nothing particular. In the districts that I taught in, they all handled Halloween. Nothing happened in school. It was all scheduled after school. There was a parade that happened right after school. That's long ago enough. There were some kids that couldn't do it because they had to get on a bus. It wasn't as much of a thing. Like, they were more interested in getting out and going to be with their friends than they were showing a costume. It's really
my favorite in Oakland was, let's see, the movie Scream had come out, and 4 kids would be lined up to get candy, and one kid would have the Scream mask on with a little pump in their hand, and they'd squeeze the pump and blood would come down. And I'd go, ah! And the kid would reach in and grab some candy, and then he'd take off the mask and hand it to the kid right behind him, who would put it on.
That's so good.
Right?
Oh, good. I love it.
It was conveyor belt Halloween, It was
conveyor belt mask. They're like, it's exhausting to own more than one.
We're not buying 4 masks. You can all go to the houses and be Scream all together.
Right. Everybody gets to be Scream.
Yeah.
Ay, Dios mío. That's funny. So what's your story?
What's my story? A perfect segue. I actually pre-recorded my story as part of my intro. So let's get to it, and you'll hear my story. You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Imperfect leaders. Are you facing challenges filling open speech-language pathologist positions within your district? Kind of a silly question, because I know you are. MPAT Speech understands the critical need for qualified professionals in your schools. They recognize that communication lies at the heart of academic success, and that's why they're dedicated to helping you bridge the gap by offering expert therapists and innovative telehealth solutions. Don't let open positions hinder your students' success. Partner with MPAT Speech today and ensure every child in your district has access to the speech therapy they deserve. MPAT Speech, EMPAT Speech.com. Empowering students, empowering schools. You're going to absolutely love this week's episode. Quintin Shepherd is quick-witted, and he's chosen a topic for his after-action review, Halloween, or the national attention he received for canceling Halloween. Now, I didn't mention this to him, but I remember when I first left Oakland and the Oakland Public Schools, and I arrived in the Midwest, and I decided that my class would celebrate Dia de los Muertos instead of Halloween. And so we built an altar in the classroom, and kids brought in pictures of their loved ones who had passed away, and it was amazing. But I can remember how my colleagues kept poking their heads into my classroom to see what on earth we were doing, cutting papel picado, making flower arrangements, arranging favorite foods and favorite things. One child, I remember, he insisted his uncle's favorite toy was a stuffed bat. So right there on the altar was a real stuffed bat. But it brought us all together and in really just a wonderful human-centered community. But that was not Quintin's experience. He learned a lot about the power of vulnerable leadership. I think you're really going to enjoy this one. Enjoy. Today on An Imperfect Leader, we've invited Dr. Quintin Shepherd to join the podcast. As the superintendent of a district recognized as an innovation district, Quintin has continued to build on past successes. He is respected for being a compassionate and vulnerable leader, and I am so thrilled to have him. Quintin Shepherd, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks so much for having me. Really, really my honor to be here.
Well, I'm really interested in talking to you because I read your article in AASA's School Administrator magazine, and I use that term, harvesting the wisdom of your community. Getting an accurate picture of what the community is thinking is so essential. And then, like you, I had been looking for a model for transformational leadership that I could anchor myself to. And so when I first started as a superintendent, I struggled to find one that really grew from authentic experiences, not just theory, one that was built on genuine learning and not a false narrative of what is supposed to be perfect. I mean, it's why I started this podcast, to honor honesty in leadership, to honor imperfection. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the book that you wrote. It's called The Secret to Transformational Leadership. I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit about your work and what readers can learn from you and your co-author, Sarah Williamson.
Happy to. And just a great introduction, because I think you perfectly captured some of what I was thinking as a superintendent as well. When I first started as a superintendent, the way I explain it when I teach superintendency courses, I've been doing this for about 18 years now in 3 different states. And when you first start off, you this is the way I put it, you play by the rules as they're handed down to you. And that's true for almost any job. It's true for teachers and principals and superintendents. And then you do the job for a while, and it starts to, parts of it at least, start to feel like a suit that doesn't quite fit right. Like, it's just, I was having this cognitive disconnect between what I was told to do or how I was shown to do the work and how I wanted to do the work. And there just was no model for that. Now, there's this notion of transformational leadership that's out there in this ethereal sense. And I'm like, okay, transformational versus transactional. And we're kind of taught that transactional is somehow bad and we're supposed to move towards transformational. And then you could think about other leadership theories that are kind of similar, right? So like you could look to the Heifetz and Linsky and talk about technical versus adaptive change. You could see some crossover there, but they don't use necessarily the same language. And then you could draw from the business world and look at Clayton Christensen, and you could talk about complicated versus complex. And again, it just feels like these things are all aligned, but with different language. And then there was this light bulb moment for me after about 5-10 years as a superintendent, where what's really needed is a language of leadership. There needs to be a language of leadership that connects this theory, this way of being in one space and this way of being in a different space. And I came to the realization, one is not better than the other. One is not right. One is not wrong. There are different types of leadership. There are very different styles of leadership for very different purposes. And it really breaks down for me, and I think especially poignant in schools, but applicable to anybody who's leading in the public sphere right now, whether it's a politician or even corporate who have to work in the public sphere, is that there's part of our work that is in fact complicated, that is dependent on things like hierarchies and power structures and transactional leadership, if you will. And there's a language we use in that style of leadership. Now, just to be very clear about what I mean when I say complicated, there's one right way to do it. And it usually requires expertise to do it. If you've done it right or wrong, you're going to be graded on it or evaluated. For instance, if we had to disassemble and reassemble an aircraft engine, neither you or I are going to be asked to do that.
Right. And we couldn't promote a shared sense of like, let's do this. How would you like to start today? Well, let's do wings today. Yeah. Okay. Well, that sounds great.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Like, it's just not going to work. But for those tasks in the school district that are complicated, then yes, transactional hierarchy and so on and so forth. But then for the opposite of complicated is complex, and complex is inherently unknowable, right? And so what's the best way to educate the kids during a pandemic? I actually don't know. I don't know but I came to the realization that nobody in the country actually knows.
No. And I would tell you that the police car parked outside my house for 4 months suggested that maybe there was a part of the community that thought I didn't know.
I love it. But, you can look at when's the best time to run a bond? When's the best time to rezone a school? When's the best time to shut down a school? When's the best time to open a school? On and the list of complex issues is almost endless. And leaders get themselves in trouble when they use the language of complicated in the space of complex, because they're sending a covert message to their community. I want for you to judge me. I want for you to give me a letter grade on this thing that's inherently unknowable and impossible to solve. And the public is ready to do it because we're basically begging them to do it by the language that we use. And so a great example. And so throughout the book, I juxtapose these words, if you will. So if it's transactional, if there's a way to do it and you must do it this way, well, then I'm going to seek your engagement with this, right? Like you need to engage with this, and so that we can make sure that you understand it and so on and so forth. But if it's complex, I couldn't care less about your engagement. In fact, your engagement is the very last thing that I want. What I really want from you is ownership. You need to have ownership around this decision that we're going to make, because I don't know what that decision is. I know what the problem is, but like all of us have to co-own this or co-author the solution, whatever it is. So the book is essentially a juxtaposition of words that you would use either in the transactional or transformational space. And to me, that then is the secret to transformational leadership, understanding the context and the language.
I want to dig into that a little bit more. In a leadership model that I have been using to advise others, there's a domain there or a dimension called nested patterns. And if I were to offer a metaphor, I would say that nested patterns are really just the muscle of the organization. They speak to how people work and treat each other. And inside that dimension, there are terms like shared leadership and empathy and compassion and creativity and courage live there too. Those are just other words for innovation. And so when I saw your article or learned more about your book, I saw a kindred spirit who really wanted a different way to lead. And so you've been talking about this juxtaposition of going back and forth, and there's not one that's better than the other. And so I've been considering transformational as fundamentally different from a traditional hierarchical. But what I hear you saying is that there are times where both of those are essential. Between complicated and complex, I think, are good examples. I'm curious, how in a complex situation do you avoid the perils that most leaders fall into when we seek feedback from our communities and they are seen as votes as opposed to exactly what they're supposed to be, helping us harvest that wisdom so that we're really gathering good feedback so that we're making the best or most informed decision that we possibly can make, knowing, as you mentioned, there isn't always a right or wrong answer. It's making the best decision with the information we have.
I just love the way that you frame this up, and the fact that we didn't get to rehearse any part of this, because you used a really important word. And I was very, very thoughtful. I spent years thinking about the words that I wanted to incorporate in this book because they have such powerful meaning and nuance at the same time. And so you said feedback. That was the word you used. And thank you for using that word, because that's the word we were taught to use. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not going to give you 5 demerit points for using that word. But you're exactly right in what you said. If we ask for feedback, full stop, feedback is transactional. Feedback tells you who you are. Feedback says, I did this thing. Would you please judge me? I'm overstating it a bit. But when we go to our community and say, I want feedback on this thing that I'm facing, community says, oh, you want us to judge you? Sure. You want us to grade you? Sure. Happy to do that. You want to operate in the systems of hierarchies and structures and so on? Yeah, we get you. We're with you. I don't want feedback. The opposite. I want the opposite of feedback. And so if feedback tells you who you are, feed forward tells you who you are becoming. Now that's a concept, right? And so this is how we do it. And this is how I encourage other leaders to do it. Introduce this language, this lexicon into your community and to your leadership team. Talk about feedback being this. We want reflective feedback. We need for you to tell us what went right and what went wrong. But we also at times want feed forward. And so we were very, very specific about the language we used when we went to our community. Now I know feed forward isn't actually a real word. Nobody uses it in English language, but we just defined it for our community. We said, look, we don't know what we're doing at this particular moment. We have some thoughts. We're really interested in, I'll use the pandemic response plan as an example. So we believe, it's just one of the tenets of our beliefs, that the people who are most impacted by the decision should have the greatest voice in that decision. Right? So when the pandemic, the trick is lead with vulnerability. Like, this really sucks and we're not really sure what to do. and lead with compassion. And I use that word very specifically. Passion is to suffer. Compassion is to suffer with. So here's my suffer point. We have to deliver an education to our kids. And we've never been through a pandemic before, and with all the technology and so on and so forth. And then I ask the teachers to share their suffering with me. So our first move was not to write a pandemic response plan or even a draft. Our first move was to go to our teachers in a mega Zoom conference, 700 teachers in a mega Zoom conference, and ask for feed forward. What would you have us do? What things should we focus on? What are you worried about? What are you concerned about? And then we crowdsourced all of that. And then what we did is the people most impacted should have the greatest voice. We went to the students. We did a mega Zoom with students, almost 500 students. Now talk about a bad idea. We didn't know at the time. It was early on the pandemic, but don't put 500 middle and high school students in one mega Zoom and expect it to go well. But it actually,
please mute. Please, you're on mute. We can't actually, could you please?
That's exactly right. But it did actually go fairly well. And we said, here's what your teacher wrote. What thoughts and questions do you have for us? And they made it better. And then we went to the parents, and we had several hundred parents, and we said, look, this is what the teachers wrote. This is what the students wrote. What are your thoughts and questions? And so then by asking for feed forward, who are we becoming? When we actually presented the plan, it was co-authored. So there was tremendous amounts of ownership. And the community's response was, okay, let's get to work. And that was it. That was the extent. I mean, it wasn't this, as you saw in some communities where there are pitchforks and fires and people screaming and yelling. And we just aren't going to have any of that because we choose our language and choose to lead differently in those spaces. So I just really thank you for that question because it was just perfectly framed up.
Thank you for the answer. It provides incredible insight into what you value and how you lead. I wonder also, the whole title of this podcast is An Imperfect Leader. And I ask this question of every guest who comes on the podcast. So here we go. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Deeply. It was, in fact, because I saw that I get invited to for a number of podcasts, and it was the title itself, An Imperfect Leader, that resonated so deeply with me because I thought, my first thought as it crossed my mind is this person gets it in that leadership is a journey, and it is a series of, some people are hesitant to use the word failure. I love the word failure. Leadership is a series of failures that you use as learning experiences. And so imperfect just recognizes that after 18 years as a superintendent, I am nowhere near perfect. I would never consider myself. This is in fact me.
And we'll be right back. Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being. And I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of An Imperfect Leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and after some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class, and the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And my guest is Dr. Quintin Shepherd. And in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they had to make, and then we discuss it. So Quintin, what happened?
Broadly, one word, Halloween.
I can already imagine, having been a principal and a teacher and a superintendent and an assistant superintendent for elementary, that there is a lot that goes into Halloween. So the moment you said Halloween, my whole body sort of went, ah.
Yeah, that was me. Let me give you some of the detail around what happened. So this was a previous superintendency, previous community. And it was just a large minority population, a majority minority population with a lot of refugee students and what have you. In my first year with the district, we did, as so many schools do, Halloween celebrations with the parades down the hallways, and all the kids get dressed up in costumes and what have you. And I was in the hallways that first year and noticed that a large percentage of the kids couldn't participate or didn't participate because they didn't have costumes, or maybe their family dynamic was such that they hadn't come to understand what that holiday meant for us, or couldn't, or just weren't given and so then we were like marching these kids down the hallway away from their peers and away from their classmates, and they didn't get to participate. And as you can imagine, elementary schools, kids are pretty upset because they see the candy and the fun and the party, and they're somehow being punished in this room where they don't get to a part of it. And I'm like, gosh, I want for my schools to be places where kids are invited and welcomed and have good feelings, not sad and crying that they can't. And plus, there's so many of these kids that don't get, it just doesn't seem right to me. Like, and then I get this moral stance about what's best for kids in my mind. And so I said, yeah, you know what? Year number 2, I said, we're not going to do the Halloween parties this year. And that was it. I was as if I'd put dynamite under my own chair. It was a horrible, not decision, but it was a horrible process because the community was very upset. And at one point I was referenced on the Rush Limbaugh show as being a jihad superintendent or something like that. I mean, it's just absurd.
Because you canceled Halloween. Death threats. Yikes. Okay, so let's go through this whole process then. So we've identified what happened. Now, what got overlooked?
The book. If somebody had written my book prior to me writing it, I would have not ended up here, because the reality is this is not a complicated one right answer solution. This is an opportunity to educate a community. This is an opportunity to have a discussion conversation with the community about what do we value in schools, how do we want kids to feel in these spaces, and on and on and on. And I just made the decision because I had the title. I could do stuff. I could make things happen. And so it wasn't if what I did mattered so much. It was if how I did it mattered to me.
Yeah. So you are, you're the superintendent. You have high integrity. You see a large percentage of children not belonging, and school should be all about belonging. Yeah. And it sounds like what got overlooked was the Peter Senge question of how do we want to be together as you think about it as an organization.
That's absolutely right.
So what did you learn about relationships, or what new relationships were formed, or it sounds like there were some real tension among those you had relations with?
For sure. Yeah. And they were really strained for a bit, but as with everything, I think you don't hide from this stuff. You don't pretend like it didn't happen. You use it as a learning opportunity. You lead with vulnerability always. And I've always done that. It just comes naturally to me. So I went to the community. I think one of the first things I did is apologize. I apologized publicly at a board meeting. Said, gosh, I did not want for this to go this way. I certainly don't want to represent our community in this way. That's not my intention whatsoever. My intention is to do what's right for kids. And it was interesting. I don't know if it's still, I guess you could probably, if you're really good online hunter, you could probably hunt this down, but you could find a bunch of articles, just a ton of articles the year that we canceled Halloween, so to speak. Now the Halloween still didn't take place. It just didn't happen in our schools. But then you look the very next year, try to find a single article. You can't find anything. You can't find a single article. And the truth is, did we bring back the Halloween parties? No. We didn't bring them back the second year. The difference between that first year and the second year was that the second year we had done a pretty good job of engaging our teachers and engaging our families and engaging even our students in the conversation. And the community came to the realization, it was like, we probably shouldn't be doing this. It just doesn't make a lot of sense for our kids. And so those relationships, I think in a lot of ways they came back even stronger. But so often leaders get themselves in trouble because they try to bury a mistake. And frankly, when you take ownership for something, when it doesn't go right, it doesn't always end well. But the truth is, as a leader, you just have to make a decision that how you're going to be, how you're going to lead. And for me, it's just really a question.
I can share an experience that is very similar in that there was one year where our lunch bills were getting very expensive. Children who had not turned in the free and reduced lunch paperwork were running up bills, and we understood that kids needed to eat. And so it was proposed, and I may have really endorsed it, I am ashamed to say now, that we would just provide a cheese sandwich for a kid who was coming through the line and didn't have food. And I will tell you that we made that decision without thinking about those who were most impacted. And it was pretty quick when all of our teachers and our principals and even I went to a restaurant once, and instead of my food coming, someone sent a cheese sandwich to me. And it was not more than a week, but it was a really incredible realization, similar to what you're describing in terms of, oh my God, what did I do? And how have I damaged my reputation to some extent about, I say we lead with empathy and compassion, and I demonstrated none of that in that moment. But to your point, at a board meeting and in the public and face-to-face with all of our principals, I apologized. It was the wrong decision. And it was a really damaging one. And relationships were strained, temporarily, because I think in the end, they really came back because you and me, we were willing to be leaders that said, I blew it. I didn't, I'm sorry. And it was genuine. And I hadn't thought about it until recently. I was having a conversation with someone who brought it to my attention. Do you remember the cheese sandwich? I went, oh my gosh, the cheese sandwich. Yeah, I do.
So, you've experienced it too. So this will make a lot of sense to you. I think sometimes if a leader hasn't experienced something like this, it won't make sense, but I'm going to say it anyway, that I think we have a somewhat strange understanding of the word courage. Like far too often we think of courage as this like magical, it's a great thing. You've got to have leadership courage to do these great things for kids and so on and so forth. But if you think about it, both you and I, it was courage that got us into it, right? And it was really vulnerability and compassion that got us out. And so while I think there's a place for courage, I just get a little, whenever I hear courage, I'm like, as long as you're okay with getting into it, and it is not always a good thing. You're right. Your courage could take you all kinds of fun places, but compassion is what's going to get you out of it.
It does appear that maybe your next book is going to be about the dimensions of courage.
Right?
Because that's a really good point. And there's a lot of truth to that. I wonder what frustrated you specifically. There's things about like what got overlooked, and sometimes that refers to what got overlooked throughout the system. But there's a part where you own sort of your own frustration.
Yeah, my biggest frustration was once that critical threshold had happened in the community, I could no longer stay on top of the message. And my message got buried. The district's message got buried, and it just had to run its cycle. And that was incredibly frustrating for me because there was this feeling of helplessness in any ability to retract that conversation and try to do what was right for my kids. And so you kind of just have to let that media cycle, especially when it hit national level. That when that media cycle takes off, you're just hanging on for the ride, really.
In the end, though, it sounds like there was some good that came out of it. You talked about subsequent years and the ability to have a mid-course correction and engage those most impacted. I wonder, would you say that was the good that came out of it? What else may have come out of that situation?
I think that's part of it, but I think that's a very, very granular. I think overall, that particular community, we were recognized by the National School Boards Association. This really phenomenal article called Agents of Change. And so what had happened prior to my arrival in the district, it had been gone through this massive change from being predominantly Jewish and very, very wealthy to being, like I said, a majority minority in community, large refugee population, large low-income population. And this event was one of many learning experiences for our community that helped us realize we've got to do it differently for our kids now. We're a different community than we were just one generation ago. And so as a result of that, we have to think differently about structures and processes and curriculum and so on and so forth. So like the good that came out of that situation is that, for instance, when I got there, kids were in our ELL programming for almost 6 years, a little over 6 years, 6.1 years before they would become fluent in English. When I left, we were at 3.2, something like it. We cut it in almost half till our kids were proficient. We'd made up almost 10 years of student achievement losses. We made it up in 2 years. Financially, we were ranked the 8th worst district in the state of Illinois. And when I left, we had achieved financial recognition, the state's highest honor. We won the school board governance recognition twice in a row. The first district in the state of Illinois to win it 2 years in a row. So that Halloween did not cause those great things, but the good thing that came out of the situation is that every time something didn't go well, like Halloween, for instance, it was another opportunity for us to engage our community in this conversation that needed to be had. And at the end of the day, the kids were the ultimate beneficiaries. So I couldn't be happier.
Sometimes people refer to the snowball effect as something in terms of damaging effect. In this case, I'm kind of thinking that the Halloween served almost as a vehicle for an examination, a re-examination of who are we and what do we want for children. And so everything from, as you described, curriculum and instructional practices, I imagine there were other thoughts about how do we want to do parent-teacher conferences and what will those look like, and all those sort of traditional ways that schools operate, that you began to really rethink those in terms of who is your community and how do we best serve them.
You did a lot of research because that was one of the things that we did. We changed how we did parent-teacher conferences. You nailed it. All of that. It was, in fact, an avalanche of change.
So Q, in the end, this podcast is really designed to help aspiring early in their career and even established leaders learn from the experiences of other leaders. So with that in mind, what advice would you give to an aspiring leader?
I think the biggest piece of advice that I would give to an aspiring leader was be really thoughtful about the mental image that you're projecting for yourself, about the type of leader you want to be. So I'm going to get a little bit researchy for a little bit, but you're going to have to bear with me. Irving Goffman was an author, researcher, sociologist. And in 1959, he wrote this seminal work called Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. And he didn't talk about teachers or educators, but he talked about policemen and firemen and doctors and so on and so forth. And he said, look, you create this mental image. When you're not a policeman, you create a mental image of what a policeman should do or say or how they should be. And then when you become a policeman, you try to live that. It's a stage in your mind and you're trying to live that out. And when I read that, I'm like, oh yeah, that was me as a teacher for sure. First few years as a teacher, I had no idea. It was a presentation of self in this mental stage. And the same thing was true as a principal for me. And the same thing was true as a superintendent for me. And the reality is that if you are looking to antiquated paradigms, to answer your question, if you're looking at antiquated paradigms of leadership and you're setting up in your head, that's how you should lead, then your first couple of years in leadership are going to be fraught with all kinds of problems, just real struggles that you don't have to go through. And so set up mental models in your mind of leaders who are leading with compassion, who are leading with vulnerability, who are in the transformational space and doing things in a way that might seem a little bit unorthodox, but that resonate well with a community. And try to follow that type of leadership because you'll be setting up a much better mental model for yourself and have a lot greater success right out of the gate.
I don't think that was too researchy. I think, in fact, what you're saying is almost the way that you started this conversation, is that we lead the way that we've been led. And we do that for a number of years until we start to think, is there a better way to do things? And truly, what you have done, and why I was so excited to talk to you, is that you've taken the work of Frederick Taylor, who said, hey, I've figured out how to bear out these efficiencies for coal miners, and I'm going to apply them to all these different institutions. And the only two that are still using them are prisons and schools. Right. And so what you're saying is, okay, let's start thinking differently about learning and the environment for kids. And I've got some secrets to transformational leadership that you should learn. And I'm really grateful to have had the time to spend with you.
Well, the one thing I would also make available for anybody who's listening is go check out the website, transformationalleadershipsecret.com. Transformationalleadershipsecret.com. We're doing a newsletter and you can get real, very practical, day-by-day things that you could start doing as early as tomorrow if you're looking for those frameworks.
Awesome. Well, again, my guest today was Dr. Quintin Shepherd, and I'd encourage you exactly to check out his book, The Secret of Transformational Leadership. He and his book can be found at www.transformationalleadershipsecret.com. And Q, thank you so much for giving me your time today. I believe that leaders are really looking for authentic story to help them meet the needs of their communities and the children that they serve. And compassion and vulnerability are constantly being touted as assets, and you're clearly modeling them each and every day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It means a lot to me.
Okay, we are back. And I told you I didn't want to talk about feedback or feed forward until the audience had heard the conversation for themselves. And now that we have, what did it make you think about?
That I need ownership. When people call it buy-in, I like ownership much better, meaning that's me. I am a part of that. That is great.
He said, feedback tells you who you are. Feed forward tells you who you are becoming.
It's great.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. Okay.
It's pretty cool. I love that. I didn't know whether I wanted to bring up, and you can decide whether you want to keep it in this podcast or not, is he uses the term majority minority more than once. And I was like, you haven't learned this. That doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a majority minority. What you want to actually say is that people of color are in the majority. I am not a minor person. I'm a major person.
I think that is totally worth including. And I'll tell you why. Here we're talking about a leader who really is thoughtful about language.
And great.
Right?
He's a good leader.
And
He's
the
really
power
strong.
of language. And so I think he would be totally open to rethinking how he describes the communities where he works, because you get a sense from the whole conversation how much he values the people and the community that he gets to serve. In fact, he says it was courage that got us into this in terms of the whole Halloween situation. It was really vulnerability and compassion that got us out. So he was anti-courage, pro-vulnerability and compassion. These are really intentional terms that he's using. And I think he would lean in and embrace this, not alternative, a more appropriate way of discussing and describing and talking about his community, which is true. A majority of children of color, a majority
of Hispanic Latino, or a majority of African-American families, like whatever the majority is, the majority has to do with the number. And if you say majority minority, what you're saying is that there are more people who are minor here.
And I think he would be aghast. He would say, oh no, that's not what I mean.
Yeah, I know that's not what you mean. I 100% know that's not. No. And for the most part, those that have used it, I come with no judgment. Like, that's not right. I totally understand why you would say that.
Yeah.
And I'm saying to you,
when we know better, we do better.
Yeah, please. There is no way you would meet my grandmother, my abuelita, and think that she was minor. It's impossible. The other thing that stood out for Quintin, it was in the beginning when he said leadership is a series of failures. And that really resonated for me. And it resonates as it relates to the concept of the podcast in my mind. But I wondered how you felt about it, especially hearing it a second time. How did that hit you now?
Oh, man. I mean, it's why I wrote that first book. As I'm writing it, I'm thinking to myself, each year I had this big event that really exposed, in my mind, my imperfection. And there is a difference between imperfect and incompetent.
I loved when you said that. I thought that was so cool. I was like, oh, and Peter Weeks was so happy. That is so true.
It was like, pitch down the middle. And it's true, because any one of us who cares about what we're doing will carry all of these mistakes that we make and hope that they will lead to better results in the future, and that a mid-course correction can be achieved where the mistake doesn't become catastrophic, that it is just a function of being human. So yeah, I do think that leadership is a series of failures, and that you want to, almost like in baseball, you just want to do a 300 average is Hall of Fame material, right? Unfortunately, educators are not held to that standard. They're held to a much higher standard of no mistakes, be perfect. Every teacher, every day, no mistakes.
Yes, I believe that's true. And I believe, as you've said before, about educators of color and what Dr. Rachel White talked about being as a female superintendent, as a female educators, like, you have to be perfect all the time, constantly. There's no wiggle room. There's no mistake. My God, when Dr. Rachel White said that she said that after first of all, the woman comes to the superintendency so much later in life, they do the job. And then they're like, the next person they hire, they're like, well, we need someone good with finance. God.
And his name better be Mike,
Eric,
or Dave, or Eric.
So good. Still makes me laugh. And oh my goodness, it's so absurd. Can I say one more thing about Quintin? About Quintin's after action review is spectacular. It's a really good one where he goes in. He's like, here's what I'm doing for kids. This is the right thing to do for kids. And he said, I put a grenade under my seat.
Right? I mean, that certainly comes with some imagery, huh? Well, Jamie, it is time for us to welcome in the new year. Happy New Year. I am so grateful to know you.
Happy New Year to you. I feel so grateful to get to do this with you. I love it, man. I truly love it.
It's so much fun. Well, I'll see you in the new year.
Happy New Year. See you in the new year. Happy New Year.
I'm Peter Stiepelman.
I'm Jamie Mansan.
You've been listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. We are proud to be imperfect leaders, so join us next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast.